it's Mr. Matty. Number 3, as I read it, the first part of that lease is for 20 years and there's no cost of living adjustment factor. Is that correct?
Mr. Ryan, sir. Mr. Attorney, would you like to speak on that?
Correct.
Okay. That being said, Mrs. Astrike, what is the, to your memory, the most recent CPIU cost of inflation living factor?
The last I checked, which is probably in May, it was only 3%, mid-3s.
Mid-3s. And I don't know how this was arrived at, but I think this is a big point. If you take 3.5% and run it out for 20 years, your money is the $20,000 they would pay you today if you effectively had a cost of living increase of 3.5% would be $39,000. So in the course of that 20-year lease, since there is no cost of living factor, your rent has dropped by over half in value. And I don't think that's appropriate, especially since there are renewal periods here for successive 10 years, so in a sense you're talking a 40-year lease, and the base, if I read this correctly, the base for the successive rents starts at the old rent that you give them tonight. And so, in effect, not only are you giving them a favorable rent for the first 20 years because there's no cost of living factor, but you're starting with an artificially low base 20 years from now. And 3.5%, that's an okay interest rate. Some of us in this room can remember 14 and 15%, okay? 5 and 6% is not uncommon. And if you have 1 year that's 10% in there, then you've really blown the socks off, my projections at 3.5%. So, I'm not going to pull a Sweeney here. I like Tom Sweeney, but he'd give you amendments and then vote against it in the end. I'm not going to do that because that's not how the game is played. This is important to me because I think it's fair to the taxpayers that they get a cost of living increase. And I would make the amendment, and I voted against this on Tuesday night, and I'm not a fan of these deals, but that'll be the way it has to go. I'll have to support them. I'm going to make a motion that the original $20,000 per year rent be subject to be adjusted annually for inflation, and then that the rent that would be effective 20 years from now, if they choose to re-up for successive 10-year periods, the beginning rent would be whatever it is 20 years from now with the cost of living.
Our motion on the floor is to amend that the 20-year rent be adjusted annually for inflation, and then if they choose to re-up that again after the 20-year initial term, that be adjusted accordingly after it has been adjusted throughout 20 years. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Chair recognizes the council member from the 8th District.
Yes, thank you. I would like to hear from somebody, if they would care, from who negotiated this on their view on this particular motion.
We'd like to hear what from a member of the negotiating committee. Could you please explain what you'd like to hear?
Well, I would like somebody from the negotiating committee, if they'd be kind enough to weigh in on how this affects the negotiations, and if this was just an oversight or this, I think that we ought to hear that before we start messing around with something that's been negotiated.
Councilmember Olson's got his light on. If you'd like to give his opinion, you can. Councilmember Olson, would you like to speak on this?
And I don't know if we can speak just on that. You might have to go back and look at the entire picture to understand how we got there. Quick Trip came to us and asked for a number of different things. One of those was $1 a year lease on that particular property for 20 years, and then subsequent 10-year packages for, I don't know, I think there was 3 10-year packages. Quick Trip's feeling behind that all was that they want to purchase that property as soon as the contamination is taken care of. We decided or felt that that was not right, that there had to be some type of a lease on that property. And we came to the $20,000 limit, and I'm not sure how we got there, but that's how we came up with the $20,000, is we needed to get something for that money. We took that out over the 20-year time frame, and we got to, was it 345,000? I don't know how that odd amount was in there, but and felt that we were getting a return back on our money, knowing that Quick Trip does want to purchase this property before the end of the term. That's how we came up with that. We felt at the end of the term of the 20 years, if they had not gone forward and purchased the property at that point, then we needed to start charging the cost of living increase. That's how we got there.
Chair recognizes council member from the 10th district.
Well, that's precisely my concern. Unless you adjust this for inflation, they have no incentive to buy it, because it gets cheaper every year for them. If we, God forbid, we have 2-3 years of 10% inflation, but at that point you're almost giving it away. And then the way it's worded, they could re-up with that rate, that interest, that rent as the base rate. And there's no incentive to buy it. And that's what concerned me as I read this. This becomes, it's a gamble. Now, if there's deflation, I didn't address that, but I assume in the spirit of our contracts, if there's deflation, we address that. But if there's inflation of any kind, and 3% doesn't sound like much, but over 20 years it's a lot, then there's no incentive to buy it at all. Why would you buy it, the old thing, why would you buy the cow when you get the milk for free? And they would, and that was my concern. I want them to buy it. And I looked at this and figured there's no incentive here to buy it. Unless the clock ticks, there's no reason for them to buy it.
Chair recognizes council member from the 7th district.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would like to take this opportunity to agree with Mr. Farmer, and in fact, the rent is probably the absolute best negotiating tool we have in getting them to move expeditiously. The bottom line here is the city should not be in the rental business in any way, shape, or form. The city is not a real estate developer, it's not a landlord, it shouldn't be in the business of renting things at all. So anything we can do to protect the taxpayers is extremely appropriate.
Chair recognizes the council president.
Thank you, Your Honor. This is the problem you get into when contracts are negotiated in total, and then when you start to pull them apart, divide them up in pieces. And so, as Councilmember Olsen said, this particular piece of it is tied in with several other aspects of the proposed contract. So while I understand the concern about the inflation aspect of it, we also need to keep in mind that there will be an inflation factor because it is a triple net lease and they will be paying property taxes on it. And therefore, as in the course of time, there very likely will be an inflation factor in any case in relation to the property taxes. And at this late stage, I don't know what benefit there would be in making an amendment, and that may or may not be acceptable then to the people with whom many hours of negotiation have taken place. And so while I understand what Mr. Farmer's concern is, that to me the fact of having a tax base, a very significant additional tax base, is benefiting every property owner in the city of La Crosse.